Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, we're citizens, Oklahoma City family traumatized after ICE raids home, but they weren't suspects, from K4.com, and that's posted by LegioX. And yeah, I really don't care how ICE or any government agency can just burst into people's homes for whatever reason. Apparently, they did have a warrant, but, the people who they wanted to get weren't there, and another family apparently had moved in. But yeah, I personally don't think, the government should be storming into people's homes, even if they do have a just cause for doing so. Sometimes, you gotta fend for yourself, and I don't think letting the government justify storming into people's homes for whatever reason is that libertarian. I guess you could have the argument, what if there's a kidnapped child in the house and you need to save them? But, sometimes, life's unfair and you just have to deal with it, because the government just can storm into your house. When it does come to like that, they always seem to choose the wrong house when it comes to stuff like that. So I personally don't think the government can just storm into people's houses regardless of their reason for doing so. Maybe if there's like a fire and it's burning to the ground, I guess. But other than that, I personally don't really trust the government to just storm into my house at any second without they could just do it for whatever reason they feel like, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now we have White House Press Secretary Leavitt on Amazon displaying a number next to the price of each product that shows how much the Trump tariffs are adding. This is a hostile and political act by Amazon, posted by Baton 13, and that's cross-post from the Public Freakout subreddit, and that's her saying that line during a briefing on Fox News. And yeah, I personally would argue, it is kind of political, because tariffs are inherently political. That being said, I do think if Amazon wanted to do it, they should be able to, but it looks like they're bending the knee to the Trump administration and they're not going to do it. But yeah, I definitely don't really care for tariffs, and I really wish the administration wasn't so obsessed with them. But, at least Trump did say that, it was always his plan all along when he was running for election. So I do think they've at least always been open about it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have H.R. 3040 to prohibit the use of ranked choice voting in elections for federal office from Congress.gov, hosted by CH4Locks. And yeah, I personally like ranked choice voting rather than the first past the post voting we have now. But regardless, I don't think ranked choice voting is all that realistic. I don't think that will just solve all our problems. I think the two major parties are just too ingrained at this point for even ranked choice voting to solve the problem. I think, we just got to get rid of. I think my personal opinion is just get rid of democracy entirely and have voluntary collectivism rather than forced collectivism, but I don't think that's too realistic either. So, ultimately, if you want to vote and do democracy, I think you should be able to, but that just doesn't give you a free pass to trample on the rights of others, I would say. And that's what a lot of politicians think it does, though, and that's a big problem for libertarians right now. A lot of politicians say, we can justify doing whatever we want since we're in elected office, but just because someone's in elected office doesn't give them the right to rule over you, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have no sarcasm or humor. If you need help, it's available, from posted by Baton 13. That's cross-post from the White People Twitter subreddit, and that looks like a post from Dave C. on Blue Sky. Just be safe if you need help. As Trump shuts down the suicide hotline, Canada's broadcasted their national hotline now is a toll-free American version, 1-877-333-6366. And yeah, personally, this is just more orange man bad propaganda. Trump did not shut down the national suicide hotline. He just took out the specifically LGBTQ part of it. Personally, I don't think we should be having a national suicide hotline in the first place. I don't think taxpayer money should be going to a suicide hotline. If you want to commit suicide, maybe you could do a private suicide hotline or just go through with it. But I personally don't think the government. There's nothing in the Constitution about a suicide hotline. I remember Justin Amash. He during his tenure in Congress, he voted against the suicide hotline because he said there's nothing in the Constitution about it, and I would agree with it. It sounds like it sounds like a good idea, but I think it should be like a lot of things done by the private sector rather than the public sector. And we have Trump issues executive order providing free legal services to police accused of wrongdoing from RollingStone.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosswords from the Law subreddit. And yeah, I don't think anything should be for free. But if the government wants to give stuff to people for free, that's on them. I personally don't really care for the police, but ultimately the state's going to look out to protect its own, and the police are one of its own. So I think that's important to remember as well. Then we have Marin. Even some people who voted for you are saying, I didn't sign up for this, so how do you answer those concerns? Trump, well, they did sign up for it, actually. Posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Fuamoy subreddit. And that's an interview for Donald Trump had on ABC recently. And yeah, I would agree with that. If you voted for Donald Trump, you signed up for whatever shit he's doing currently. And if you want to regret that, that's fine. But don't pretend that you didn't sign up for this. So I would very much agree with Trump's statement there. Then we have Biden. How can his cult still believe this shit? From Ragnar OKXG. And they said Trump blames Biden overhang after GDP shrinks in first quarter, says growth will take a while, and they linked to an article from Ground News about that. And yeah, I personally do think, Trump's blaming Biden too much, but during Biden's term, the Democrats were always saying, oh, the out-group's responsible for all the problems, not him. And, it just goes to show you, the politicians aren't going to take personal responsibility for the problems America faces. They'll just blame it on the out-group. And that's going to be true whenever the Democrats get back in power. Suddenly everything will be the Republicans' fault, even though they're in power again. And yeah, that's why, politics is very unlibertarian currently. No one's taking personal responsibility. It's all just in-group good, out-group bad. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Temper Tantrum Noam, and that's an article from CBS News. Christy Noam says if Kilmore Abrigo Garcia was sent back to U.S., we would immediately deport him again, and that was posted by Nietzsche, and they added, wonder if she'll also shoot one of her dogs if we bring him back to the U.S. And, yeah, that's just another Orange Man Bad headline. Well, it's an Orange Man Bad friend headline, I should say, which pretty much fall under blanket Orange Man Bad. But, yeah, personally, I definitely do think, Kilmore Garcia, he probably shouldn't have been deported in the first place. But, it's definitely the circle jerk around him is getting kind of old. And, it's interesting how he was in the prison, supposedly dead. And then next thing you know, he was drinking martinis with that Maryland senator. So, I think he could just be a crisis actor and this could all just be a psyop. But, everything seems to be a psyop these days, especially in the age of social media. So, you don't really know anymore. Then we have Trump. I could get Abrego Garcia back now from abcnews.go.com. And that's from Swamp Yankee Dan. That's across from the Law subreddit. And yeah, if Trump wants to get him back, I think he should get him back. Personally, I'm just tired. I'm tired of any guy who's in the news for more than 2 weeks. And I just wish the circle jerk around the guy would end. And yeah, personally, I would get him back and just leave him alone. But, if they just want to keep him in El Salvador, that they can justify doing whatever they want to. Then we have journalists in the UK love censorship and defend it with whataboutism. And that's the YouTube video from Warren Smith, Secret Scholar Society, a 26-year-old school's entire room of smug British boomers and journalists. And that was posted by Spear Sammy, and they added, boomer journalists without, a sharp 26-year-old who points out the lack of freedom of speech in Britain. And yeah, I would agree with that. Reddit that always says how bad a tyrant Trump is, but they conveniently ignore how almost all the other Western countries increasingly crack down on free speech. And yeah, they don't care because that's the in-group cracking down on free speech rather than the out-group. They always say, oh, Trump says you can't have free speech anymore because anti-Semitism. I agree with that, but then they say, oh, we got censored because of hate speech and misinformation, and that's not the answer either. They're just mad that they're not the ones pressing the boot down on you, rather the out-group's doing it instead of the in-group. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Columbia student Mohsen Madawi released from ICE detention from Ground News, posted by Dr. Who 07. And yeah, personally, I don't think we should have government detention in the first place. But if they want to arrest anyone for every reason, I think they should be able to. I think this guy was in detention for free speech reasons. It might have been speech that was very critical of Israel, maybe saying, nuke Israel and kill every single person in it. But he has a right to say whatever shit he wants, as does everyone else. And I like how the left's becoming more free speech oriented when it's meant for members of the in group. But they still don't want free speech if it's for members of the out group. So a lot of people are just hypocritical, as I like to say. Most people these days don't have values, only teams. When it's the in group does it, it's free speech. When the out group does it, it's hate speech. And it's a lot like that. When the in group does it, it's anti-Zionism. When the out group does it, it's anti-Semitism. And that just goes to show you how people can do the same thing, and it just determined, and they can do essentially the same thing, and when they do it, it's completely fine, justified, but when you do it, it's literally Hitler. And yeah, that's why I just can't take a lot of political debate seriously anymore, because they can do whatever they want, but when you do it, you're a Nazi. And eventually, you just gotta rise above it and call them out on their bullshit, which is why I do this podcast, and I'm generally trying to be active on social media. But yeah, I think it's also interesting, they say they're for free speech, but they've had me censored from this subreddit for months on end with no end in sight, and they say there's a dictator in the White House, but I would say the biggest dictator right now is the social media technocracy, which is kind of a lot. Some of it's aligned with Trump, but there's definitely a good chunk of it, like Reddit, who's just a DNC propaganda outlet, and they say, oh, we need to support free speech, but they'll censor you for months on end if you do a wrong thing. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.